Uncle Murphy, can you hear Lily? The 3-year-old girl whispered into the darkness, her tiny voice shaking with fear. Her small hands trembled as she stepped deeper into the forgotten underground cellar beneath the Moretti estate. Nobody was supposed to know this place existed. Nobody except Murphy Moretti. The most feared man in the city was sitting helplessly in the center of the room, tied tightly to an iron chair. His expensive white shirt was soaked with blood. A broken steel pocket watch lay beneath his black leather shoes, its cracked glass reflecting the faint light from the ceiling. For 20 years, people had whispered his name with fear. Murphy Moretti, the man who controlled an empire, the man who never begged, the man who made enemies disappear overnight. But tonight, the most powerful man in the underworld was saved by a 3-year-old girl holding a pair of pink kindergarten scissors. 24 hours earlier, Murphy Moretti stood alone beside the enormous window of his 3rd-floor study. The autumn rain hit the glass softly, covering the city below with a gray mist. At 38 years old, Murphy carried the weight of the Moretti Empire on his shoulders. To outsiders, he was a monster, a man without emotions, a man who could destroy an enemy with a single sentence. But those who truly knew him understood there were 3 things nobody could change about Murphy Moretti. First, he never removed his black leather gloves in front of strangers, not even during business negotiations, not even while signing million-dollar contracts. Second, every month, an anonymous donation of $50,000 was sent to a children's shelter in the city. Nobody knew the reason. Third, inside the locked drawer of his walnut desk was a small steel pocket watch, a watch that once belonged to his father, a watch that stopped the bullet meant for Murphy's heart years ago. Murphy slowly opened the drawer. His fingers touched the old metal surface. The words engraved on the back were almost invisible after decades of wear. Time is everything. He closed his eyes for a moment. His father had taught him many things before dying. How to survive, how to fight, how to protect the people who mattered. But he never taught him how to forgive betrayal. Outside the study window, a little girl in a yellow sweater chased a white butterfly across the garden. "Lily, slow down!" A woman's worried voice came from behind. Murphy looked down. There she was. Lily Carter, 3 years old, the daughter of Allie Carter, the only child in the entire Moretti estate who was not afraid of him. The little girl stopped beneath the window and looked upward. When she saw Murphy standing there, she smiled brightly. "Uncle Murphy!" Most people froze when they saw him. Lily waved. Murphy stared at her silently. Then something impossible happened. He removed his black leather glove. Slowly, almost carefully. He placed his bare hand against the cold window, watching a child laugh. For a moment, the most feared man in the city looked like an ordinary man. Then he pulled the glove back on and returned to being Murphy Moretti. 7 years earlier, Allie Carter had arrived at the Moretti estate during a stormy night. She was 25 years old, exhausted, terrified, holding a newborn baby in her arms. Her husband had died in a construction accident. She had nowhere to go, nobody willing to help her. The enormous iron gates of the Moretti estate were the last place she could try. When Murphy saw her standing outside in the rain, he almost ordered security to send her away. Almost. Until he looked at the baby. A tiny girl sleeping peacefully despite the storm. Murphy stared at the child for several seconds. Then he said only 2 words. "She stays." He never explained why. Allie never asked. From that night forward, she became a housekeeper at the estate, and Lily became the only person who could walk into Murphy's world without fear. Mr. Moretti. A man's voice interrupted his thoughts. Murphy turned around. Victor Romano stood at the door carrying his morning coffee. Victor had been Murphy's closest lieutenant for 11 years. The man everyone trusted. The man Murphy once considered a brother. Victor placed the coffee on the desk. You have a meeting with the Eastern Division at noon. Murphy nodded. Cancel it. Victor looked surprised. Something wrong? Murphy looked toward the garden. Lily has her school performance today. Victor forced a smile. Of course. Family comes first. The words sounded sincere. But behind Victor's eyes, something dark moved silently. That night, while Murphy believed he was surrounded by loyal people, Victor Romano stood alone inside his private apartment. A burner phone rested against his ear. Everything is ready. The voice on the other side belonged to Adrian Volkov, the leader of a rival organization. Victor looked through the window at the city lights. In 48 hours, Murphy Moretti will disappear. Adrian laughed. And you will control the Moretti Empire. Victor smiled. Not control. He paused.
Own. The Moretti estate had always been a place where silence carried more weight than words. The enormous mansion stood on the edge of Long Island, surrounded by tall iron gates and endless rows of ancient trees. To outsiders, it looked like a beautiful private residence. But everyone in the city knew the truth. Behind those gates lived Murphy Moretti, the man whose name could stop conversations in crowded rooms. The man whose enemies disappeared before they had the chance to regret their decisions. The man who built an empire through fear. But inside those walls, there was a secret that nobody outside the family knew. Murphy Moretti had never been afraid of death. He had been afraid of becoming exactly like the monsters he fought. That was why, at every morning, before anyone else woke up, Murphy walked alone into the garden. No guards, no weapons, no meetings, just silence. And usually, a little girl waiting for him. Uncle Murphy, the tiny voice came from behind him. Murphy stopped walking. Only one person in the entire world could approach him without the authority announcing her arrival. He slowly turned around. Lily Carter stood there, wearing a pink jacket that was slightly too large for her. Her brown hair was tied into two messy little braids. In her hands was a small paper drawing. Murphy looked down. What is it? Lily smiled proudly. I made this for you. Murphy took the drawing. It was a child's picture. A large black figure stood beside a much smaller figure wearing a yellow dress. There was also a house, a sun, and a very crooked-looking dog. Murphy stared at it. You drew this? Lily nodded. That's you. She pointed at the tall black figure. Murphy raised an eyebrow. Why am I so big? Because you protect everyone. The answer was immediate. Simple. Completely innocent. Murphy looked away. For years, people had called him many things. Monster, king, devil. But never protector. He folded the drawing carefully. Thank you. Lily's eyes widened. Because Murphy Moretti rarely thanked anyone. Not employees. Not business partners. Not even people who had saved his life. But he thanked her. From the balcony above, Allie Carter watched quietly. She had seen moments like this many times. But every single time, they surprised her. Because Murphy Moretti was not the man the world believed him to be. 7 years ago, when she first arrived at this estate, she had been terrified of him. She remembered that night clearly. The storm, the rain, the cold stone steps beneath her feet, and the newborn baby sleeping in her arms. She had knocked on the massive iron gate 3 times. Nobody answered. She almost turned away. Then the gate opened. A group of armed men stood behind it, and in the center was Murphy Moretti. At that time, Allie knew exactly who he was. Everyone did. The Moretti family controlled businesses across the city. Some legal, some not. Murphy was a man people respected because they feared him. Allie expected cruelty. She expected anger. She expected him to tell her to leave. Instead, Murphy looked at the baby. Not her. The baby. The newborn Lily was wrapped in a thin blanket, sleeping peacefully despite the freezing rain. Murphy stared for several seconds. Then he asked, "What is her name?" Allie was surprised. Nobody had asked that first. "Lily." Murphy looked at the child again. Then he said, "She stays." Those 3 words changed everything. Over the years, Allie learned things about Murphy that nobody else knew. She learned he hated wasted food because his father once went hungry during difficult years. She learned he secretly paid hospital bills for strangers. She learned he visited the children's shelter every Christmas, but never allowed anyone to photograph him. She learned the cold expression he showed the world was not because he had no heart. It was because he had spent his entire life protecting the pieces of it. But she also knew something else. A man like Murphy Moretti always had enemies, and enemies eventually found weaknesses. That evening, Murphy sat in his study reviewing financial reports. The room was quiet, except for the sound of papers moving. Then there was a soft knock. "Come in." The door opened. Allie stepped inside. She placed a cup of tea on the desk. "You forgot dinner again." Murphy didn't look up. "I wasn't hungry." Allie crossed her arms. "You said that yesterday." Murphy finally looked at her. For a moment, neither spoke. Most people avoided challenging him. Allie never did. "You need to eat," she said. Murphy leaned back. "Are you ordering me?" A small smile appeared on Allie's face. "Maybe." Something strange happened. Murphy almost smiled. "Almost. You are the only person in this house who talks to me like that. Maybe because everyone else is afraid of you. And you aren't?" Allie became quiet. She looked at him honestly. "When I first came here," she paused. "Yes." Murphy looked away. "But now?" Allie glanced toward the window, where Lily was playing outside with one of the gardeners. "Now I think you're just a lonely man pretending not to be." For several seconds, the room was silent. Murphy had heard thousands of accusations in his life, but those words affected him more than any threat because they were true. Meanwhile, across the city, Victor Romano watched security footage from inside a dark room. On the screen was Murphy, and beside him, Lily. Victor stared. For 11 years, he had stood beside Murphy Moretti. He had taken bullets for him. He had fought beside him. He had earned his trust. But he never received what he wanted. Power, respect, the empire. Everything belonged to Murphy. Victor believed he deserved it. "I spent 11 years protecting your throne," Victor whispered. His fingers tightened around the phone. "But you gave everything to a woman and a child." A voice came through the speaker. "Are you still certain?" Victor smiled coldly. "More certain than ever." The voice belonged to Adrian Volkov, the leader of the Volkov organization. When will Murphy disappear? Victor looked again at the strain. Murphy was kneeling in the garden, helping Lily tie her shoelaces. The most feared man in the city, doing something as ordinary as helping a child. Victor's expression hardened. Tomorrow night. Adrian laughed. And after that? Victor looked at himself in the mirror. After that, the Moretti Empire finally belongs to me. The next morning, something felt different. Murphy noticed immediately. He had survived long enough to recognize danger before it appeared. The guards at the eastern entrance changed shifts 3 minutes late. A driver who had worked for the family for 6 years avoided eye contact. A phone call ended too quickly when Murphy entered the room. Small details, invisible to ordinary people. But Murphy Moretti was alive because he noticed things others ignored. He stood in the hallway. Marco Bruno approached. Marco had been with Murphy for 14 years. Unlike Victor, Marco never wanted power. He only wanted loyalty. Something wrong, boss? Murphy looked toward the garden. Loyalty is being tested. Marco's expression changed. Victor? Murphy didn't answer. But silence was enough. Marco understood. That afternoon, Murphy received a message. A warehouse on the west side. Urgent. A possible security breach. The information came from Victor. Normally, Murphy would have trusted him without hesitation, but something felt wrong. He looked at the steel pocket watch inside his jacket. His father's watch. The same watch that had saved his life years ago. Time is everything. His father's words echoed in his mind. Murphy picked up his coat. I'm going. Marco immediately stood. I'll come with you. Murphy shook his head. No. Marco frowned. Boss? Murphy looked at him. Stay here. A pause. Protect Allie and Lily. Marco understood immediately. Because Murphy Moretti had never asked anyone to protect something more important than his empire. Until now. That night, Murphy Moretti drove toward the warehouse. And for the first time in 11 years, he entered a battlefield without knowing who was standing behind the enemy. Because the person who betrayed him was someone he once called family. The road to the west warehouse was unusually quiet. Murphy Moretti sat in the back seat of the black sedan, staring through the tinted window at the passing city lights. Normally, he hated silence. Silence gave people too much room to hide. But tonight, silence was exactly what he needed. Because something was wrong. He could feel it. For 20 years, Murphy had survived because he trusted his instincts more than anyone's words. People lied. Documents lied. Even evidence could be manipulated. But fear never lied. And tonight, the city itself seemed afraid. The driver, Marco's replacement, kept both hands tightly on the steering wheel. Too tightly, Murphy noticed. Relax. The driver glanced at the mirror. Sir? Your hands. The young man immediately loosened his grip. Sorry, Mr. Moretti. Murphy didn't respond. A nervous driver was not unusual. But a trained driver who suddenly became nervous? That was different. Murphy leaned back. Change route. The driver froze for half a second. Sir? Take the bridge. But the warehouse is faster through. The bridge. His voice was calm, but absolute. The driver immediately turned. Murphy watched the reflection in the window. The man hesitated. Only for a moment. But that was enough. Murphy remembered. He remembered every small mistake, every hesitation, every unusual movement. Because in his world, a small mistake was often the first sign of a gun being pointed at your head.
20 minutes later, the sedan stopped near the abandoned ore-house. The building stood beside the river, surrounded by rusted metal fences and broken concrete. It looked empty. Too empty. Murphy stepped out. The wind carried the smell of rain. Marco's voice came through the encrypted earpiece. "Boss, I don't like this." Murphy looked around. "Neither do I."
"Then why are you still going inside?" A long silence followed. Finally, Murphy answered, "Because if someone is testing my loyalty," he looked toward the dark entrance, "I need to know who." The warehouse door opened with a loud metallic sound. Inside was darkness. No workers, no security, no emergency lights, nothing. Murphy walked forward slowly. His footsteps echoed. Then, the lights turned on. Suddenly, dozens of men appeared from the shadows. Weapons raised. Murphy stopped. Not because he was afraid, because he understood. The trap was not designed to kill him quickly. It was designed to make him realize who betrayed him. A man stepped forward. Slow clapping filled the warehouse. Impressive. Murphy's expression changed slightly, because he knew that voice. Victor. Victor Romano walked into the light. No mask, no disguise, no shame. For the first time in 11 years, he stood in front of Murphy as an enemy. Murphy stared at him. The disappointment was almost invisible. Almost. "I wondered how long it would take you to show your real face." Victor smiled. "That's the problem with you, Murphy." He walked closer. "You always think you understand people." Murphy remained silent. Victor laughed. "You saved me. You trusted me. You gave me everything." His smile disappeared. "But you never gave me the one thing I wanted." Murphy looked at him. "And what was that?" Victor spread his arms. "The throne. For most people, betrayal created anger. For Murphy Moretti, it created something colder. Understanding." He studied Victor. The way he stood, the way he moved, the confidence, the timing. This was not a sudden betrayal. This had been planned for years. "How long?" Victor frowned. "What? How long have you been planning this?" For a moment, Victor said nothing. Then he smiled. 7 years. Murphy's eyes narrowed. 7. Yes. Victor walked around him. "Do you know what happened 7 years ago?" Murphy didn't answer. "The night Allie Carter came here, the warehouse became silent. Victor's voice became bitter. Before her, you were different. You were focused. You were unstoppable. But then, that woman arrived. And that child." Victor laughed. "You started changing." Murphy looked at him coldly. "That bothered you?" "It destroyed everything." Victor shouted. "You built an empire because you had nothing. But suddenly, you had a family." His voice lowered. "And I realized something." "What?" Victor leaned closer. "You weren't a king anymore. You were becoming a man." Murphy looked at him. For years, he thought Victor wanted power. But now he understood. Victor didn't hate weakness. He hated the fact that Murphy had found something worth protecting. Something Victor never had. "You're wrong." Victor smiled. "About what?" Family didn't make me weak. Murphy's voice was quiet. It reminded me why I became strong. Victor's expression hardened. Still pretending to be noble? He stepped back. Tonight, the city will wake up without Murphy Moretti. One of the men behind Victor raised his weapon. Murphy noticed. The man's finger was already tightening. But Murphy didn't move, because he was calculating. Number of enemies, distance, exit rights, time, everything. Then his fingers touched the object inside his jacket. The steel pocket watch. His father's watch. The same one he carried every day. The reminder. Not of death, but survival. Victor noticed the movement. Still carrying that old thing. Murphy looked down. My father gave the names. Victor laughed. Your father died because he trusted the wrong people. A dangerous silence filled the room. For the first time, something changed in Murphy's eyes. Not anger. Something deeper. Pain. Because Vic just crossed a line. The gun fired. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. The bullet moved directly toward Murphy's chest. But the steel pocket watch stopped it. The impact shattered the glass. The force pushed Murphy backward. The bullet tore through the metal and at his shoulder. Blood spread across his white shirt. The room exploded into chaos. Murphy fell. The world turned distant. The last thing he heard was Victor's voice. Good God, Moretti. Hours later, the city received the news. Murphy Moretti was gone. Dead. At least, that was what Victor wanted everyone to believe. At the Moretti estate, Allie stood frozen in the hallway. She watched the television screen. A reporter's voice filled the room. We have confirmed that tribe leader Murphy Moretti was involved in a deadly incident tonight. Allie stopped breathing. No. Lily ran into the room, holding her stuffed rabbit. My man? Allie quickly turned over the television. She forced a smile. Nothing happened, sweetheart. But Lily looked at her mother's face. Children notice things adults try to hide. Uncle Murphy is hurt. Allie froze. What did you say? Lily hugged her rabbit tighter. I had a bad dream, she whispered. Uncle Murphy was alone. That night, while everyone believed Murphy Moretti was dead, a little girl got up crying, and somehow, without knowing why,
She walked toward the one place nobody was supposed to find, the hidden cellar beneath the estate. The world believed Murphy Moretti was dead. By sunrise, the news had spread across the entire city. Some people celebrated. Some people panicked. Some people quietly began making plans to take what they believed was now ownerless. Because when a king falls, everyone wants to claim the throne. But they all made one mistake. They forgot one thing. Murphy Moretti had survived worse things than bullets. He had survived betrayal, deep beneath the Moretti estate, in a place hidden from every map and every security record. Murphy opened his eyes. At first, there was only darkness, cold, heavy, silent. His breathing was slow. His shoulder burned with unbearable pain. The bullet had torn through the pocket watch and entered his body, but the old steel case had changed its path. It had saved his life. Again. Murphy tried to move. Pain shot through his entire body. His wrists were tied tightly to an iron chair. Plastic restraints cut into his skin.
Someone had dragged him here after the shooting. Not killed him, brought him somewhere hidden. That meant one thing. Victor wanted him to suffer. Murphy lowered his head. A small laugh escaped his mouth. Not because it was funny, because it was almost unbelievable. After all these years, the person who knew him best was the person who understood him the least. Victor stood in the Moretti estate's main hall. Hundreds of important figures had gathered. Business leaders, family members, loyal soldiers. Everyone was waiting. Victor stood at the front, wearing a black suit, looking like a grieving friend. I wish things had ended differently. His voice sounded emotional, perfectly controlled. Murphy was my brother. Several older members of the organization lowered their heads. They believed him, because Victor had spent 11 years building that trust. Until we know who was responsible, Victor continued, I will temporarily manage the family affairs. A few people exchanged looks. Temporary. That was always the word ambitious men used before they took everything. But nobody challenged him. Not yet. Then the doors opened. Everyone turned. It was Allie Carter. She walked into the room slowly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were calm. Victor looked at her. Allie. She ignored the sympathy around her. Where is Murphy? The room became silent. Victor sighed. Allie. Where is he? Her voice was stronger this time. Victor stepped closer. I know this is difficult. But Allie noticed something. Something small. Something everyone else missed. Victor was not grieving. Not really. His eyes were not filled with sadness. They were filled with satisfaction. Allie had lived 7 years around dangerous people. She had learned something important. Real grief made people look lost. Victor looked victorious. Later that night, Allie walked through the empty hallway. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't accept it, because something inside her refused to believe Murphy was gone. Maybe it was impossible. Maybe it was denial. But she remembered something. Murphy Moretti did not die easily. Not ever. Then she heard voices. She stopped. The study door was slightly open. Victor was inside, talking on the phone. Allie moved closer. I told you. Victor's voice was cold. He is finished. A pause. No. Nobody knows. Another pause. The empire is mine now. Allie's heart stopped. Mine. Not ours. Not the family's. Mine. She stepped backwards silently. Her hand covered her mouth. Victor betrayed Murphy. But worse, Murphy might still be alive. She ran. Not toward security. Not toward the others. Toward the only person who could help. Marco Bruno. She found him in the old garage. Marco was sitting alone. His face was expressionless, but his hands were clenched. You heard. Allie stopped. Marco looked up. I know. Victor did it. Marco nodded. I suspected. Allie's eyes widened. You knew? I knew something was wrong. Marco looked away. But Murphy told me one thing before he left. What? Marco's voice lowered. If anything happens. He paused. Protect Allie and Lily. Allie froze. Because those words told her something. Murphy expected danger. Maybe he even expected betrayal. He knew? Marco shook his head. Not who. He only knew something was coming. A silence filled the garage. Then Lily's voice suddenly appeared. Mama? Both adults turned. The little girl stood at the entrance, holding her rabbit. Her eyes were sleepy. "Why are you crying?" Allie quickly wiped her face. "I'm okay." But Lily looked at Marco. Then she whispered, "Uncle Murphy needs help." Marco and Allie exchanged a look. Nobody knew why Lily said it. Maybe it was a child's imagination. Maybe it was a dream. But then Lily walked towards the old wall beside the garage. She touched a small wooden panel. "There." Marco frowned. "What?" Lily pointed. "Uncle Murphy sewed me." Marco walked closer. He examined the wall. Behind years of dust was a hidden mechanism. A secret passage. His expression changed. Because only one person knew about this. Murphy. 7 years ago, Murphy had shown Lily the hidden passages beneath the estate. Not because she needed to know, but because Lily had once asked, "Does your house have secret rooms?" Murphy had answered, "Maybe." She had looked disappointed. So he had shown her one. A small secret hallway. A place where nobody else could go. At the time, he never imagined that one day, that secret would save his life. Marco opened the hidden door. Cold air rushed out. Allie looked into the darkness. "What is down there?" Marco's face became serious. "The old underground cellar. The one nobody uses." Allie looked at Lily. The little girl stared into the darkness. "He's there." Her voice was barely a whisper. Marco didn't question it, because he knew Murphy, and he knew Lily. Sometimes children notice things adults ignored. Deep underground, Murphy heard something. A sound. Small footsteps. Impossible. His eyes opened. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Then he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. A tiny voice echoed through the darkness. "Uncle Murphy?" Murphy froze. No, it couldn't be. "Lily?" The footsteps became faster. A small figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs. 3-year-old Lily stood there, her eyes filled with tears. When she saw him tied to the chair, her face changed. Fear, confusion, pain. "Uncle Murphy." She ran toward him. Murphy's voice was weak. Lily stopped, but she didn't listen. She threw herself against him. The most feared man in the city, the man who made enemies tremble, was hugged by a little girl who only cared that he was hurt. "I'm here." Her small voice shook. "I found you." For the first time in many years, Murphy Moretti felt something stronger than pain. Hope. Lily looked at the ropes, then at the small pink scissors attached to her backpack. She pulled them out. "I can help." Murphy almost smiled. "Lily, I'm strong." She carefully tried cutting the restraints. The plastic was too thick. Her little hands trembled, but she refused to stop. "I won't leave you." Those words hit Murphy harder than the bullet, because everyone in his life had eventually wanted something from him. Money, power, protection. Everyone, except her. She wanted nothing. She just didn't want him to be alone. Above them, Victor continued celebrating his victory. He believed Murphy Moretti had disappeared forever. He believed the empire belonged to him. He believed a 3-year-old girl was nothing but a weakness. But he didn't understand something. The biggest mistake Victor Romano ever made was underestimating the smallest person in the Moretti family. The small pink scissors broke after the third attempt. The plastic blade snapped in half. The tiny piece fell onto the cold stone floor. Lily stared at the broken scissors. For a moment, disappointment filled her little face. Then she looked back at Murphy, and shook her head. No. Her voice was quiet, but determined. No giving up. Murphy watched her in silence. A man like him had spent his entire life surrounded by people who surrendered when things became difficult. Men who ran. Men who betrayed. Men who chose themselves when danger arrived. But this little girl, this 3-year-old child, stood in a dark underground cellar, facing something much bigger than herself. And she refused to leave. Lily. Murphy's voice was softer than usual. You need to go upstairs. The little girl immediately shook her head. No. It's dangerous. No. Murphy looked at her. For anyone else, that look would have been enough to make them step back. But Lily only hugged her rabbit tighter. You always tell me, she thought carefully. Brave people don't leave their friends. Murphy froze. Because he remembered. 3 months earlier, Lily had fallen while learning to ride a bicycle. She had cried. She had wanted to quit. Murphy had crouched beside her and told her, falling doesn't make you weak, it means you are learning. Now she was repeating his own words back to him. Murphy lowered his head. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a small smile. You listen too much. Lily nodded seriously. Because Uncle Murphy says smart things. A quiet laugh escaped him. A real laugh. The kind nobody in the Moretti organization had heard in years. Then suddenly, a sound came from above. Footsteps. Murphy's expression changed instantly. The softness disappeared. The dangerous man returned. Lily. The little girl looked at him. Go behind that wall. But now, his voice was firm. Not angry. Protective. Lily understood. She quickly ran toward the hidden corner behind the old stone shelves. The cellar door opened. Light entered the darkness. A man stepped inside. Now Victor. One of his guards. The man looked around. Still alive? Murphy didn't answer. The guard laughed. Victor said you might surprise us. He walked closer. But he said you wouldn't survive the night. Murphy stared at him. You made one mistake. The guard stopped.
What? Murphy's voice was cold. You believed Victor understood me? The guard smiled. You are tied to a chair. Your empire belongs to someone else. And nobody knows you're alive. Murphy looked toward the shadows where Lily was hiding. Then back at the guard. You forgot something. What? Murphy's eyes became darker. I am still Murphy Moretti. The guard raised his weapon. But before he could move, a small object flew from the darkness. A stuffed rabbit. It hit the man's hand. Not enough to hurt, but enough to surprise him. The guard turned. What the? Lily ran forward. No hurting Uncle Murphy. Everything stopped. The guard stared. Murphy's eyes widened. Lily. The little girl stood between them, terrified, but standing. The guard almost laughed. A child? He lowered his weapon slightly. This is your weakness? Murphy's expression changed. No. The guard looked confused. Murphy spoke quietly. She's the reason you already lost. At that exact moment, the cellar lights suddenly turned off. Darkness swallowed the room. A second later, a heavy impact. A cry. The sound of someone falling. Then silence. The lights returned. Marco Bruno stood behind the guard. The man was unconscious on the floor. Lily ran immediately toward Murphy. Marco shook his head.
I leave you alone for one night. He looked at the child. And somehow, the smallest person here saves your life. Murphy looked at Lily, then at Marco. Nobody can know. Marco's expression became serious. Boss, if Victor knows you're alive, he'll come after Allie and Lily. Marco understood. The plan changed instantly. Murphy Moretti was no longer simply fighting for his empire. He was fighting for his family. Upstairs, Allie waited anxiously. Every second felt like an hour. When the hidden door opened, she almost cried out. Then she saw Murphy. Alive. Walking. Barely. But alive. Her hand covered her mouth. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Murphy looked at her. Allie. That was all it took. The tears came. Not because she was weak. Because for several hours, she believed she had lost him. She stepped forward, then stopped, as if afraid touching him would make him disappear. You're alive. Murphy nodded. Yes. Allie looked at his injured shoulder. Her expression changed. Who did this? Silence. She already knew. Victor. Murphy didn't answer. But he didn't need to. Later that night, Dr. Ritchie arrived through the secret entrance. The older doctor had treated the Moretti family for 15 years. When he saw Murphy's injury, his face became serious. You are lucky. Murphy sat quietly while the doctor removed the remaining bullet fragment. The watch. Dr. Ritchie looked at the broken steel pieces. Your father's old watch saved you again. Murphy looked down. The glass was destroyed. The hands had stopped moving forever. Years. He had carried it as a reminder of his father's sacrifice. Now it had taken its final duty. Allie stood nearby, watching him. You almost died. Murphy looked at her. I know. And you still went there alone. A pause. I needed to know who betrayed me. Allie's eyes became wet. What if you didn't come back? Murphy had no answer. Because for the first time, he realized there was someone waiting for him to return. Not as a boss. Not as a powerful man. Just as Murphy. Meanwhile, Victor sat inside Murphy's study. The room that had belonged to Murphy for years. Now Victor sat behind his desk. He poured himself a drink. The empire was his. At least, that was what he believed. A message appeared on his phone. Search completed. Murphy confirmed dead. Victor smiled. Then, another message arrived. Allie Carter remains under observation. Victor stared at the name. Allie. And then Lily. The child. He laughed softly. The great Murphy Moretti. Destroyed by a woman and a child. He didn't know. He was wrong. Completely wrong. Because those two people were not Murphy's weakness. They were the reason he had something worth fighting for. In the hidden room beneath the estate, Murphy sat with Marco, Dante, and Antonio, the loyal members of his inner circle. Dante placed several documents on the table. Victor moved money from 6 accounts. Antonio added. He contacted Volkov's people 3 months ago. Marco looked at Murphy. He planned this for years. Murphy nodded. The room became silent. And Murphy spoke. Everyone looked at him. And a father protecting his daughter was more dangerous than a king protecting his throne. That night, Lily fell asleep beside Murphy's bed. She refused to leave, even when Allie tried to carry her away. No, the little girl held Murphy's hand. Uncle Murphy needs me. Murphy looked down at her tiny fingers wrapped around his. A powerful man, a feared man, a man who had commanded thousands, now unable to move because a child was holding his hand. And somehow, it felt like the safest place in the world. 3 days later, Victor Romano would stand before the entire Moretti family. He would announce himself as the new leader. He would believe victory was complete. But when the doors opened, he would see something impossible. The man he buried, walking back into the room. 3 days. That was how long Victor Romano had waited. 3 days since the city believed Murphy Moretti was dead. 3 days since whispers began spreading through every corner of the underworld. 3 days since Victor sat behind Murphy's desk and convinced himself he had already won. But Victor made one mistake. He confused silence with victory. The Moretti family hall had never been so crowded. 47 senior members of the organization sat around the long black marble table. Men who had worked beside Murphy for decades. Men who had built businesses. Men who had protected the Moretti name through wars, betrayals, and countless enemies. Today, they were waiting for a new leader. At the head of the table sat Victor Romano. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit. A glass of expensive wine rested beside his hand. Everything about him looked like a man who had already taken the throne. Thank you all for coming. Victor stood slowly. His voice carried through the enormous room. I wish this meeting happened under different circumstances. Several older members lowered their heads. Victor continued. Murphy Moretti was not only my leader. He paused. He was my brother. The words sounded convincing, almost beautiful. But some people in the room noticed something. Victor smiled too much. A grieving man remembered the person he lost. A man hungry for power remembered what he gained. At the back of the room, Marco Bruno stood silently. He had been allowed to attend because Victor believed Marco was still loyal. That was his second mistake. Marco watched every movement, every expression, every person who avoided eye contact. Dante stood nearby, hidden among the security team. Antino waited outside. Everything was ready, but they were waiting for one person. Victor lifted a document. According to the rules of the Moretti family, the leadership position must be transferred when the previous head is confirmed deceased. He looked around. Today, I accept this responsibility. A few people nodded. Others remained silent. Victor smiled. Any objections? Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the room was completely quiet. Then, the massive wooden doors opened. The sound echoed across the hall. Everyone turned. Victor froze, because standing in the doorway was a man who should not exist. A man wearing a dark coat, A man with a scar across his shoulder. A man whose eyes carried the cold certainty everyone remembered. Murphy Moretti, alive. The wine glass slipped from Victor's hand. It shattered on the marble floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because everyone in the room understood one thing. The dead had returned. Murphy walked slowly into the room. Each step was calm, controlled, almost effortless. Marco lowered his head slightly, not out of fear, out of respect. The old members of the family stared in disbelief. One elderly man whispered, "Impossible." Murphy stopped at the end of the table. His eyes moved across the room, then landed on Victor. "You look comfortable." Victor's face turned pale. For the first time in years, he had no words. "Murphy," his voice cracked. "You?" Murphy tilted his head slightly. "I was dead, wasn't I?" Nobody spoke. Victor tried to recover. "You don't understand what happened." Murphy almost smiled. "Actually, I understand everything." Dante stepped forward. A large screen behind them turned on. The room darkened. The first image appeared. Bank records, transfers, hidden accounts. Victor's name. Gasps filled the room. Then came audio recordings. Victor's voice. Clear, unmistakable. "I want the Empire. I want Murphy gone. I want everything." Victor stared at the screen. The confidence disappeared. "No." He looked around. "This is fake." Dante calmly replied, "We thought you might say that." Another file appeared. Security footage. Victor meeting Adrian Volkov, planning the attack, planning Murphy's death. The room became silent. Because betrayal was one thing, but betrayal of the Moretti family was another. Victor looked at Murphy. "You planned this." Murphy didn't answer. Victor laughed suddenly. A desperate laugh. "You let me think you won. You let me expose myself." Murphy walked closer. "Yes." Victor's face twisted. "Why?" Murphy stopped. "Because I needed the truth." Victor stared. "The truth?" Murphy looked around the room. "Power built through fear can be stolen. Trust built through loyalty cannot." The words hit harder than any weapon, because Victor realized something. Murphy hadn't survived because he was stronger. He survived because people truly believed in him. Victor stepped backward. Then, suddenly, his hand moved toward his jacket. Marco immediately reached for his weapon, but Murphy raised his hand. "Wait." Everyone froze. Victor pulled out a small pistol. He grabbed the nearest person. But it wasn't a guard. It was Lily. The room erupted. Allie screamed, "Lily!" Nobody had noticed the little girl entering the hall. She had followed Murphy, because she didn't want to miss him coming home. Victor pulled her close. The gun pressed against her shoulder. His breathing became unstable. "Stay back." For the first time, Victor looked afraid. Murphy stared at him. Not with anger. Not with hatred. With disappointment. "Let her go." Victor laughed. "Now you understand." He looked at Lily. "This is your weakness." Murphy's eyes became colder. "No." Victor frowned. "What?" Murphy stepped forward. "You still don't understand." He looked at Lily. "She is not my weakness." A pause. "She is the reason I survived." Lily looked up at Victor. She wasn't crying. She was scared. But she remembered something. Murphy always told her, "Fear is okay. Being controlled by fear is not." Slowly, she reached into her pocket. Victor didn't notice. Nobody did, except Murphy, because he knew what she was holding. A small pink pair of scissors, the same kind she carried everywhere. "Lily," Murphy whispered. The little girl understood. At the perfect moment, she moved. She bit Victor's hand. Hard. Victor screamed. The gun shifted. Marco moved instantly. The weapon fell. Antino rushed forward and pulled Lily away. Allie grabbed her daughter and held her tightly. The entire room watched. The little girl who had once been considered a weakness had just saved Murphy Moretti again. Victor collapsed onto the floor. The empire, the power, the throne, everything disappeared in seconds. Murphy looked down at him. For a long time, nobody spoke. Everyone expected revenge. Everyone expected punishment. Because that was the old Murphy Moretti, the man who never forgave. But this Murphy was different. He looked at Lily, then at Allie, then back at Victor. "You know what your biggest mistake, wife?" Victor looked up. Murphy continued. "You thought becoming powerful meant losing your heart." A pause. "But the truth is, the person with nothing left to protect is the weakest person in the room." The authorities arrived an hour later. For the first time in his life, Murphy Moretti handed an enemy over instead of ending him himself. Victor Romano would face trial. Not a grave. A courtroom. A place where everyone would know what he had done. That night, the Moretti estate was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear. The silence of peace. Murphy sat on the garden steps. Lily sat beside him. "Uncle Murphy?" "Yeah?" "Are you happy?" Murphy looked toward the house. Allie stood near the doorway, watching them with a soft smile. For years, people asked Murphy how much power he had, how much money, how many enemies feared him. Nobody ever asked if he was happy. Until now. Murphy looked at Lily. "Yes?" The answer came easily. "I am." Several weeks later, something changed in the Moretti family. The empire did not disappear, but it changed. The illegal operations were closed. The money was redirected into legitimate businesses. Hospitals, children's programs, scholarships. The same man who had once been feared became known for protecting people. Not because he wanted to be famous, because Lily had shown him another way. One evening, Murphy stayed in his study. The old pocket watch sat inside a glass case. The broken hands were frozen forever. The time had stopped, but Murphy had not. Allie entered quietly. "You kept it." Murphy nodded. "It saved my life." She looked at the watch. "What does it mean to you now?" Murphy thought for a moment, then answered. "It reminds me that even random things can still have a purpose." Allie smiled. "And people?" Murphy looked at her. "People too." Outside, Lily ran through the garden. Her laughter filled the air. And for the first time in decades, the Moretti estate did not feel like a fortress. It felt like home. 6 months had passed since the night Murphy Moretti returned from the dead. 6 months since Victor Romano's betrayal was exposed. 6 months since the entire city made something impossible. The most weird man in the underworld had chosen mercy. And people still didn't understand why. In the past,
Everyone knew the Moretti, but one knew. If you crossed him, you paid the price. There were no second chances, no forgiveness, no mercy. That was how he survived. That was how he built an empire. But now, people saw something giant.
The same man who once terrified entire organizations was now sitting in a small hospital room, helping a 7-year-old boy choose a book. The same hands that once held weapons were now signing documents to fund children's medical care. The same voice that once gave orders was now patiently answering a little girl's endless questions. The world couldn't understand, but Murphy did. Because Lily had changed the meaning of strength. Uncle Murphy? Murphy looked up from the book in his hand. Lily ran into the room carrying a drawing. She was no longer the frightened little girl from the underground cellar. She was still small, still innocent, still carrying her stuffed rabbit everywhere. But there was something different in her eyes. Confidence. Because she knew something important. Even the strongest people sometimes needed help, and even the smallest person could make a difference. What did you draw this time? Murphy asked. Lily climbed onto the chair beside him. This is our family. Murphy looked down. The picture showed 4 people. Allie, Lily, Murphy, and a small house. Not the giant Moretti estate, just a simple house. Murphy pointed at the drawing. Why isn't this the mansion? Lily looked confused. Because families don't live in houses. Murphy raised an eyebrow. They don't? She shook her head. Families live together. For a moment, Murphy couldn't speak, because those words were simple. But they carried something he had spent his entire life searching for. A home. That evening, Murphy stood outside the balcony. The city lights stretched into the distance. Years ago, he used to stand here and count enemies. Now, he counted something else. People he wanted to protect. The door behind him opened. He didn't turn. You're getting better at walking quietly. Allie smiled. You knew it was me. I always know when you're around. She stepped beside him. For a while they watched the city together. Then, Allie spoke. You changed. Murphy looked at her. Is that a bad thing? No. She smiled softly. It's the first time I've seen you look alive. The words stayed with him. Because she was right. For years, Murphy existed. He worked. He fought. He survived. But he never truly lived. Until Lily. Until Allie. Are you afraid? Allie suddenly asked. Murphy looked surprised. Of what? Everything you changed. She looked toward the city. You had an entire empire built around fear. Now you're trying to build something different. Some people will see kindness as weakness. Murphy was silent, because she touched the exact fear he never admitted. Changing was dangerous. A predator who became gentle could become a target. But then he remembered Lily standing between him and a gun, a 3-year-old child who had more courage than many armed men. No, he finally answered. I'm not afraid. Allie looked at him. Why? Murphy looked back at the house, where Lily was sleeping. Because I spent my whole life trying to become someone nobody could hurt. A pause. But I forgot the point wasn't avoiding pain. It was finding someone worth suffering for. A few days later, the Moretti family gathered for an important meeting. But this time, it was different. There were no threats, no weapons, no fear. Murphy stood at the front of the room. Everyone watched him. I built this organization on one belief. Silence filled the hall. That power means control. He paused. I was wrong. Several people looked surprised. Moretti admitting he was wrong was something almost impossible. Power is responsibility. The person at the top doesn't stand above everyone else. He stands in front. Marco smiled slightly. Because he remembered the old Murphy. The man who trusted nobody. The man who carried every burden alone. This was not the same person. After the meeting, Marco stayed behind. You know something? Murphy looked at him. What? Marco smiled. I never thought I'd see this day. What day? The day Moretti gives a speech about compassion. Murphy almost smiled. Neither did I. Marco looked toward the garden. Lily really changed you. Murphy was quiet. Then he nodded. She saved me. Marco corrected him. She saved your life. Murphy looked thoughtful. No. A pause. She saved everything after it. That night, Murphy found Allie sitting in the garden. The same place where Lily used to chase butterflies. The same place where everything began. You still come here. Allie looked up. It's peaceful. Murphy sat beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Murphy said, 7 years ago. Allie turned. When you arrived at the gate, he looked at the trees. I almost told security to send you away. Allie smiled. I know. You knew? You looked like you wanted to. Murphy laughed quietly. A rare sound. But then I saw Lily. Allie lowered her eyes. She was so small. Yes. And you were afraid. Murphy looked at her. Afraid? Allie nodded. You were afraid to care. The words hit him. I lost my father when I was young. Murphy spoke slowly. He trusted someone who betrayed him. My whole life, I believed caring about people gave them the power to destroy me. Allie listened, quietly. But then Lily came. A small smile appeared. She didn't know who I was. She didn't care about my name. She didn't care about my money. She only knew I was the man who helped her reach a cookie jar. Allie laughed softly. Murphy continued. To her, I wasn't Murphy Moretti. I was just Uncle Murphy. The silence between them felt different now. Not uncomfortable. Warm. Then Allie asked, What happens now? Murphy looked at her. What do you mean? Your future. Your family. Us. The last word was quiet. Almost a whisper. Murphy looked at the woman who had walked into his life carrying nothing but a baby and hope. The woman who never feared his power, only worried about his loneliness. I don't know how to do this. Allie smiled. Do what? Be normal. She laughed. You don't have to be normal. A pause. Just be you. Inside the house, Lily pressed her face against the window, watching them. She turned to her stuffed rabbit. They're talking. The rabbit obviously didn't answer. Lily nodded seriously. I think Uncle Murphy needs help. She walked toward the door, then stopped, because she remembered something. Sometimes people needed time, even adults, especially adults. So she smiled and went back to bed. 1 year later, the Moretti estate looked completely different. The walls were still there. The gates were still there. The security was still there. But the atmosphere had changed. Children played in the gardens during charity events. Families entered through the gates without fear. The place that once represented power now represented protection. Murphy stood in the garden watching Wally run toward him. "Uncle Murphy!" He opened his arms. She jumped into his embrace. Behind her, Allie smiled, and Murphy realized something. The empire he built had never been his greatest achievement. The greatest thing he ever built was a family. That evening, Murphy opened the drawer in his study. The broken pocket watch remained inside the glass case. Beside it was something new. A small drawing from Lily. 3 words written with uneven handwriting. "My best family." Murphy touched the paper gently. Years ago, his father gave him a watch. A reminder that time was everything. Now he finally understood. Time was not about how long you lived. It was about who you chose to spend it with. 2 years later, the city had changed. People who once whispered the name Murphy Moretti with fear now spoke of him with something else. Respect. Not the kind of respect created by fear, the kind earned through actions. The Moretti name was still powerful. The organization was still influential. But the old rumors had disappeared. No more stories about enemies vanishing. No more whispers about a man who ruled through darkness. Instead, people talked about the hospitals that opened, the children's foundations that provided education, the businesses that created thousands of jobs. Nobody believed it at first. A man like Murphy Moretti was not supposed to change. But he did. Not because someone forced him. Not because he wanted public approval. He changed because one little girl looked at him and saw something nobody else saw. A good man hidden beneath the armor. The Moretti estate was unusually loud that morning. Not because of arguments. Not because of danger. Because of laughter. "Uncle Murphy." Murphy looked up from the breakfast table. A small girl ran toward him wearing a blue dress and holding a school certificate. She was 5 years old now. But to Murphy, she would always be the tiny 3-year-old who walked into the darkness and found him. "Lily." She climbed onto the chair beside him. "Look." She proudly held up the paper. "I got first place." Murphy examined it carefully. Then he nodded. "I'm proud of you." Lily smiled. "But you have to say more." Murphy raised an eyebrow. "More?" "Yes." She crossed her arms. "Teachers say parents say more words." Murphy looked toward Allie. She was standing near the kitchen counter trying not to laugh. Allie whispered, "She wants a bigger reaction." Murphy looked back at Lily. The most feared man in the city took a deep breath, then said, "You are intelligent." Lily waited. "And brave." She waited again. And Murphy paused. "This was harder than negotiating with criminals. And I am very proud that you are my daughter." The room became silent, because Murphy Moretti rarely used those words. "My daughter." Lily's eyes widened. "Really?" Murphy nodded. "Really." She immediately hugged him, and Murphy hugged her back. From the doorway, Allie watched quietly. She still remembered the first day she met him. The cold man standing behind the iron gates. The man who looked like he had never smiled. Now, he was sitting at a breakfast table covered with children's drawings, arguing with a 5-year-old about eating vegetables. Life was strange. Sometimes the people who looked the least human were the ones who had been waiting the longest for someone to remind them they were. Later that afternoon, Murphy received a message, one that changed his expression immediately. Allie noticed. She always noticed. What happened? Murphy looked at the phone. A name from my past. She became serious. Someone dangerous? Murphy was quiet. Then, someone who knows things they shouldn't. The message was simple. One sentence. Your father left something unfinished. Murphy stared at the screen. His father, a name he rarely discussed. A wound that never fully healed. For years, Murphy believed his father's death was simply a tragedy, a betrayal, a bullet, an ending. But maybe it wasn't the ending. That night, Murphy entered the old study, the same room where he kept the broken pocket watch. He opened the drawer. The glass case reflected his face. For a moment, he saw the old Murphy, the angry young man, the man who wanted revenge, the man who believed the only way to survive was to become stronger than everyone else. Then he looked at the photo beside the watch, a family photo. Allie, Lily, him, and he remembered. He was no longer that man. Marco Bruno entered quietly. You got the message? Murphy nodded. Marco's expression was serious. I was hoping that chapter of your life was over. So was I. Dante entered behind him. We investigated. He placed a folder on the desk. The sender is Alexander Vass. Murphy's eyes narrowed. That name had not been spoken in 20 years. He was connected to my father. Marco nodded. Before your father died, Voss disappeared. Everyone thought he was gone. Murphy opened the folder. Inside were old photographs. His father, Alexander Voss, and another person, a man Murphy recognized, Victor, Romano's father. Murphy's expression changed. Victor knew. Dante nodded. Maybe not everything, but enough. For years, Murphy believed Victor's betrayal was about ambition, about greed. But now, there was something deeper. A plan that started long before Victor entered his life. A shadow that existed before Murphy became powerful. The next morning, Murphy told Allie everything. Not because he wanted to worry her, because he promised himself he would never hide the truth from his family. After everything they had survived, she deserved honesty. Allie listened quietly. When he finished, she asked, "Are you going after him?" Murphy looked away. The old answer would have been yes, without hesitation, without mercy. But now, he had a different question. Do I have to? Allie looked surprised. Murphy continued. For years, I chased every person who hurt me. I thought revenge would give me peace, but it never did. He looked toward Lily playing outside. The only time I felt peace was when I stopped looking backward. Allie reached for his hand. A simple gesture, but one that meant everything. You don't have to fight every battle alone anymore. Murphy looked at her. Those words were more powerful than any weapon, because they were true. That evening, Lily found Murphy sitting alone in the garden. She climbed onto the bench beside him. Uncle Murphy? Yes. Are you sad? Murphy looked at her. Why do you think that? Because your eyes look like before. He froze. Before Lily. Before Allie. Before he learned how to smile. Children saw more than adults expected. I'm okay. Lily tilted her head. That's what Mama says when she is not okay. Murphy almost laughed. You and your mother. He shook his head, always noticing everything. Lily thought for a moment, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small, folded paper. What is this? A gift. Murphy opened it. Inside was a drawing. Not a house this time. Not a family. Something different. A bridge. On one side was a dark figure. On the other side was a bright family. And in the middle, a little girl holding the hand of the dark figure. Murphy stared at it. What does this mean? Lily answered. You were on the dark side. She pointed at the drawing. But I helped you cross. Murphy looked at her. His eyes became emotional. Because somehow, a 5-year-old child understood something he spent decades learning. Sometimes people didn't need someone to save them. Sometimes they needed someone to show them there was another side. 3 days later, Murphy Moretti stood at the old family cemetery, the place where his father rested. For the first time in 20 years, he came without anger, only peace. He placed the broken pocket watch beside the grave. I used to think I needed to become stronger in everyone. He looked at the stone. But I was wrong. A quiet wind passed through the trees. I needed to become someone worth coming home to.
Behind him, Allie and Lily waited. Not because Murphy needed protection, but because he finally understood something. The strongest person was not the one who stood alone. It was the one who had people waiting when he returned. Murphy turned around. Lily waved. Uncle Murphy, he smiled, and walked toward them, toward home. The past never truly disappeared. It only waited. For 2 years, Murphy Moretti believed he had finally escaped the shadows that followed him his entire life. He had built something new, a family, a home, a future. But every empire had a foundation, and sometimes the deepest cracks were hidden beneath that foundation. The first sign came on a rainy Monday morning. Murphy was in his study when Dante entered. The expression on his face was enough. Something was wrong. Say it. Dante placed a file on the desk. We found Alexander Voss. Murphy's eyes narrowed. After 20 years, that name had returned. Where? New York. A pause. He's been here for months. Murphy opened the file. Inside were photographs. A man in his 70s. Gray hair. Cold eyes. A face Murphy has seen only once when he was young. But he remembered. Because some faces were impossible to forget. Alexander Voss. 20 years ago, he was one of the most powerful men connected to the underground world. Not because he was violent, because he was patient. He never rushed. He never acted emotionally. He was the kind of man who planted a seed and waited decades for it to grow. Murphy's father once trusted him. That was the mistake. My father knew him. Dante nodded. More than that. He placed another document on the table. Your father and Voss built the original Moretti network together. Murphy remained silent. That wasn't new information. What was new was the next page. Dante continued. Your father's death wasn't random. The room became still. For years,
Murphy believed he understood what happened. A business conflict, a betrayal, an enemy attack. But now, everything changed. What are you saying? Dante looked at him. Your father wasn't killed because he lost a war. A pause. He was killed because he refused to become what Voss wanted him to be. Murphy stood. The old anger returned for a moment. The anger he thought he had buried. The anger that created him. Where is he? Dante hesitated. Murphy. Where? An old private club downtown. Murphy grabbed his coat. Dante watched him. For the first time in years, he saw the old Murphy. The man who walked into danger without hesitation. The man who solved every problem with force. That night, Allie found him preparing to leave. She didn't ask where. She already knew. You're going after him? Murphy stopped. I need answers. Allie walked closer. And if those answers hurt? Silence. If they make you angry? More silence. If they turn you back into the man you used to be? Murphy looked at her. That question stopped him. Because deep down, that was the real danger. Not Alexander Voss. Not revenge. Himself. I don't know who I will be when I see him, Murphy admitted. It was the first time he said something like that. Allie reached out and held his hand. You do. He looked at her. You already know. She smiled gently. Because the old Murphy would never stand here, worrying about becoming the old Murphy. Those words stayed with him. Before leaving, Murphy went to Lily's room. She was asleep. Her stuffed rabbit was beside her. Murphy stood at the doorway for several minutes. Then Lily suddenly opened her eyes. Uncle Murphy? He smiled. Sorry, I woke you. She rubbed her eyes. Are you leaving? For a little while. Are you going somewhere dangerous? Murphy was surprised. Children shouldn't understand danger. But Lily had grown up surrounded by it. Maybe. She thought carefully, then reached for his hand. Remember. What? You don't have to be scary. Murphy looked at her. You don't? She shook her head. You just have to come home. Those words followed him all the way downtown. The private club was hidden behind an ordinary building. No signs. No cameras. No attention. Exactly the kind of place Alexander Voss preferred. Murphy entered, alone. The guards recognized him immediately. Nobody stopped him. Because even after everything changed, the name Murphy Moretti still carried weight. At the top floor, Alexander Voss sat beside a fireplace. He looked older than the photographs, but his eyes were exactly the same. Cold. Calculating. Murphy. The old man smiled. I wondered how long it would take you. Murphy stood across from him. You knew I would come. Of course. Voss poured 2 glasses of wine. You are your father's son. Murphy didn't touch the glass. Tell me the truth. Voss smiled. About what? My father. A long silence. Then Voss laughed softly. You spent 20 years believing your father was a victim. He looked into the fire. He wasn't.
Murphy's expression changed.
He was a man who made a choice. What choice? To walk away. Voss looked at him. He wanted to leave the life behind. Murphy said nothing. He wanted peace. A bitter smile appeared. And men like us don't get peace. Murphy stared. Did you kill him? The room became silent. Finally, Voss answered. No. Murphy's eyes narrowed. Then who? Voss looked directly at him. Your father? The words struck like a weapon. What? Your father chose his own death? Murphy stepped forward. You're lying. No. Voss shook his head. He knew the people around him were becoming monsters. He knew the empire he built was destroying everyone. He wanted someone to break the cycle. Murphy's breathing slowed. Why didn't he tell me? Voss looked away. Because you were 16. You were angry. You wanted revenge. And he was afraid you would become exactly like him. For 20 years, Murphy carried a wound created by a lie that shaped his entire life. He became powerful because he wanted nobody to hurt him again. He became feared because he never wanted to feel helpless. But what if his father never wanted him to become powerful? What if he wanted him to become free? Why tell me now? Voss smiled. Because I need something from you. There it was. The truth behind everything. Murphy almost laughed. Even after 20 years, people still wanted something. Of course. Voss leaned forward. Your father left something. What? Evidence. Murphy froze. Evidence of everything. Every deal. Every betrayal. Every name. Voss looked at him. Your father hid it before he died. And I know where it is. Murphy understood. This wasn't about the past. It was about power. Again. Always power. Where? Voss smiled. Before I tell you, I need you to answer one question. Murphy remained silent. Are you still the same man who killed without hesitation? The old Murphy would have answered yes, immediately. But now, he thought of Lily, Allie, the home waiting for him. No. Voss looked surprised. Then who are you? Murphy turned toward the door. A man who has something to lose. Outside the club, a car waited. But Murphy noticed immediately. The driver wasn't his. The license plate was unfamiliar. The security pattern was wrong. A trap. Again? He sighed softly. Some things never change. Then his phone rang. Allie's number. He answered. Murphy. Her voice was tense. Someone came to the house. His expression changed. Who? A pause. Men connected to Voss. Everything became clear. This was never about revenge. It was a message. Voss wanted Murphy to choose. The past, or his family. Murphy looked back at the club, then at the road leading home. Two worlds, one behind him, one waiting ahead. For most of his life. He chose the first. But not anymore. He started walking. Not toward the enemy. Toward home. Because for the first time in his life, Murphy Moretti understood something. The greatest victory wasn't defeating every enemy. It was refusing to become one. The first thing Murphy Moretti did when he arrived home was not pick up a weapon. Was not call his men. Was not prepare for revenge. He walked straight into the house. Because for the first time in his life,
He understood what mattered most. The Moretti estate was surrounded by security. Men stood in every corner. Cars waited outside. The entire property had become a fortress. But Murphy didn't feel protected. Not until he saw one person. Lily. The little girl ran down the stairs. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Uncle Murphy!" Murphy caught her before she reached the last step. He lifted her into his arms. For a moment, the most feared man in the city closed his eyes and simply held the person who had saved him twice. "I thought you were leaving," Lily whispered. Murphy looked at her. "Never." The answer came immediately. "No matter what happens, I come home." Allie stood behind them. She had been trying to stay strong. For Lily, for the family, for everyone. But seeing Murphy holding her daughter, alive, safe, broke the wall she had built around herself. She walked forward. "Murphy." He looked at her, and in that moment, neither of them needed words, because they had already survived the things that destroyed most people. Betrayal, fear, loss. They had survived them together. Later that night, the entire Moretti inner circle gathered. Marco, Dante, Antonio. Allie sat beside Murphy. Not behind him. Not as someone who needed protection. Beside him. That small difference meant everything. Murphy placed the documents from Alexander Voss on the table. "Voss knows where my father's evidence is." Dante looked surprised. "Evidence of what?" Murphy opened the folder. Inside were decades-old records. Names. Transactions. Deals. Secrets. Everything his father had collected before his death. Marco looked serious. "If this gets out, it destroys many powerful people." Murphy nodded. "Yes." Antonio frowned. "Then, Voss wants to use it as leverage." "Exactly." Dante looked at Murphy. "What does he want?" Murphy was silent, then answered, "Me."
Everyone understood. Alexander Voss didn't want money. He didn't want territory. He wanted Murphy Moretti. The final piece of a plan that began 20 years ago. The next morning, Murphy returned to the old club. But this time, he didn't go alone. Not because he needed protection. Because he had finally stopped carrying every burden himself. Marco stayed outside. Dante monitored communications. Antonio controlled security. And Allie waited for him. Alexander Voss was sitting in the same chair, as if he knew Murphy would return. "I knew you would come." Murphy looked at him. "You know nothing about me." Voss smiled. "Don't I?" He stood slowly. "You are exactly like your father." Murphy remained calm. "No?" Voss looked surprised. "No. My father tried to escape his darkness." Murphy stepped closer. "I spent years running toward mine." A pause. "But then I met people who showed me I could stop." Voss stared at him. "You think love makes you stronger?" Murphy answered, "I know it does." The old man laughed. "Love makes people weak." "No." Murphy shook his head. "Fear makes people weak. Love gives them a reason to stand." For the first time, Alexander Voss looked uncertain. Because he realized something. The Moretti standing before him was not the man he had planned for. He expected a monster. He found a man. Your father left you a message. Voss walked to a locked cabinet. Inside was a small wooden box. Murphy froze. The box looked familiar, like the one his father used decades ago. Voss placed it on the table. Open it. Murphy didn't move. Why? Because you spent 20 years searching for revenge. Voss looked at him. Now, find out what you were supposed to find. Murphy opened the box. Inside was an old letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. His father's. His hands became still. For years, he imagined this moment. A final answer. A final explanation. Slowly, he opened it. My son, if you are reading this, it means I failed to protect you from the world I created. I know you will be angry. I know you will want answers. But I hope you understand something. Power is not what protects people. People are what make power meaningful. Do not spend your life becoming someone nobody can hurt. Because a heart that cannot be hurt cannot truly love either. Find someone worth protecting. Find a reason to come home. And when you do, let go of the darkness I gave you. Murphy stopped reading. The room was silent. For 20 years, he blamed his father for leaving him. But now he understood. His father had not abandoned him. He had been trying to save him. Voss watched him. So, Murphy folded the letter carefully. So, would you destroy me? The old answer would have been yes. The old Murphy would have ended everything. But Murphy thought about Lily, her small hands holding scissors, her voice saying, you just have to come home. He thought about Allie, the woman who saw him before anyone else did. He thought about the man he wanted to become. No. Voss frowned. No. Murphy looked at him. You spent your entire life believing power was everything. A pause. I won't prove you right. The authorities entered minutes later, because Murphy had already sent the evidence. Not just Vass's crimes. Everything. 20 years of corruption. Everything. 20 years of corruption.
Every person involved. Every secret. Everything. The past would finally end. Not through revenge. Through truth. Several months later, the city heard unexpected news. Alexander Voss was sentenced. The old criminal networks collapsed. The Moretti organization transformed completely. And Murphy Moretti, the man everyone thought would become the next monster, became something else. A protector. One spring morning, the Moretti estate garden was filled with flowers. Lily ran across the grass. Older now. Happier. Mom! Allie smiled. What happened? Uncle Murphy said I can plant flowers. Allie looked toward Murphy. You let her near the garden tools? Murphy pretended to be serious. She said she was responsible. Allie raised an eyebrow. And you believed her? Murphy looked at Lily. Then smiled. Yes,
Allie laughed, because she knew the old Murphy Moretti would never have trusted anyone that easily. That evening, Murphy stood beneath the same tree where he used to sit alone. Allie walked beside him. You still think about the past? Sometimes. Do you regret anything? Murphy looked toward the house, where Lily was drawing, where laughter filled rooms that were once silent. No. Allie smiled. Not even the painful parts? Murphy shook his head. Because without them, he looked at her, I wouldn't have found this. A week later, something special happened. Murphy Moretti walked Lily to school. Not with guards. Not surrounded by fear. Just him. A father. Children looked at him curiously. They didn't know his old reputation. They didn't know the stories. To them, he was just Lily's dad. And that was enough. At the school gate, Lily grabbed his hand. Promise something. What? Promise you won't disappear. Murphy knelt down, looking directly into her eyes. I promise. Why? Because he remembered the night she found him in the darkness. The night a little girl saved a man everyone else feared. Because I finally know where I belong. That evening, Murphy returned home. Not to an empire. Not to a throne. Not to a world built on fear. He returned to a woman waiting by the door. A little girl running into his arms. A home filled with warmth. And for the first time in his entire life, Murphy Moretti understood the one thing no amount of power could ever buy. Peace.